Hello everyone, welcome back to Ballistic Beacon. Tensions are once again rising across the Gaza Strip, where Israeli air and ground operations are continuing to test a fragile ceasefire that was recently brokered by the United States. The agreement, designed to halt months of devastating conflict, now hangs in the balance as renewed strikes and military activity threaten to undo months of diplomatic effort. The truce was initially announced as a step towards stabilizing the region, offering a path to both humanitarian relief and a potential long-term political settlement. Yet despite this agreement, explosions, artillery fire, and air raids have been reported across Gaza. Civilians who had cautiously begun to return to their homes are once again fleeing for safety. The ceasefire that was meant to hold peace is showing clear signs of collapse. Under the framework of the agreement, both Israel and Hamas were expected to uphold specific commitments. Hamas was required to release hostages, halt rocket attacks, and stop military operations. In return, Israel was to reduce its troop presence in densely populated areas, allow greater access for humanitarian aid, and avoid provocative military actions. Washington, acting as the principal mediator, declared that this deal represented the only viable path to end the conflict and prevent a complete humanitarian breakdown. However, the situation on the ground tells a different story. In recent days, Israeli fighter jets have carried out strikes in central and southern Gaza, targeting what the military described as operational infrastructure and suspected militant compounds. Local reports indicate that several of these strikes hit residential areas, causing civilian casualties, including women and children. The Israeli government has defended its actions as limited defensive measures, insisting that the operations are in direct response to ceasefire violations by Hamas. Eyewitnesses across Gaza have described scenes of panic and destruction. Entire blocks in the Nuseirat and Khan Younis regions were reportedly leveled overnight. Rescue teams and volunteers spent hours digging through the rubble to recover the injured. Families who had begun rebuilding their homes after months of war once again found themselves displaced, with many taking shelter in makeshift camps or overcrowded schools. On the Israeli side, the military maintains that the ceasefire remains formally in effect, but argues that its enforcement requires proactive security actions. According to statements released by the Israeli Defense Forces, their operations are intended to prevent future attacks and neutralize imminent threats detected through intelligence channels. The government in Tel Aviv has stated that it holds Hamas fully responsible for any escalation, warning that further ceasefire breaches will invite decisive military responses. The United States, which worked intensively to mediate the ceasefire, has expressed growing concern over the latest developments. Senior American officials have urged restraint, warning that continued Israeli strikes and militant provocations could completely derail the fragile peace process. Diplomatic sources suggest that Washington is in direct contact with both sides, attempting to reestablish confidence and prevent further deterioration. American analysts have described the situation as a critical test of Israel's credibility and Washington's diplomatic influence. For Gaza's 3 million residents, life remains dominated by uncertainty. Although the large-scale bombardments have subsided compared to previous months, basic living conditions remain catastrophic. Electricity and clean water supplies are scarce, food shortages are widespread, and health care facilities are struggling to function. The humanitarian corridor that was meant to facilitate aid delivery has not operated at full capacity, leaving thousands without medicine, shelter, or food assistance. United Nations agencies have reported that less than 1/4 of the planned aid convoys have successfully entered the territory. Fuel restrictions have led to severe shortages across hospitals, causing delays in surgeries and critical care. Aid groups on the ground have warned that any further escalation could trigger a complete collapse of public health and sanitation systems, increasing the risk of disease outbreaks among displaced populations. While Israel has pledged to expand humanitarian access, coordination challenges and security checks have slowed progress. At the same time, Palestinian groups accuse Israel of deliberately using aid restrictions as leverage to pressure Hamas. Both sides have traded accusations over who bears responsibility for the ongoing crisis. Politically, Israel's leadership faces internal divisions over how to manage the ceasefire. Some members of the governing coalition are demanding tougher measures against Hamas, while others warn that continued strikes risk isolating Israel diplomatically. The Israeli public remains divided between those calling for security through force and those advocating a political resolution that could end the recurring cycles of violence. For Hamas, the ceasefire has become a tightrope walk between demonstrating compliance and maintaining its influence among Palestinians. The group is under pressure from Gaza's civilian population, which is weary of endless war, but it also faces challenges from smaller militant factions that reject the truce altogether. Any perceived weakness could threaten Hamas's authority and invite further internal unrest. Regional actors such as Egypt and Qatar, who assisted the United States in brokering the ceasefire, have also become increasingly alarmed. Both nations have invested heavily in mediation efforts and now fear that renewed violence could destabilize their own security environments. Cairo has reportedly increased border patrols near Rafah, wary of potential refugee surges or spillover violence. Qatar, which has maintained dialogue with Hamas's political leadership, is pressing for renewed diplomatic talks to salvage the agreement. Analysts suggest that several risk factors could lead to the complete collapse of the truce. Firstly, militant provocations, even small scale attacks such as sporadic rocket fire, could trigger disproportionate Israeli responses. Secondly, Israeli preemptive strikes, justified as preventive security measures, may inflame tensions and invite retaliation. Thirdly, political dynamics within Israel and Palestine remain volatile. Any internal leadership disputes could result in renewed confrontation. Lastly, the humanitarian situation itself poses a major threat. Desperation among Gaza's civilians could easily turn into unrest or renewed violence if relief does not reach them soon. As the ceasefire continues to fray, global attention is returning to Gaza. International human rights organizations have criticized both sides for failing to protect civilians and for obstructing aid delivery. European and Arab diplomats are pushing for an emergency summit aimed at reinforcing the agreement and preventing a full resumption of hostilities. Yet, despite these efforts, there remains little evidence of progress on the ground. Experts believe that the next few days will be crucial. If the current pattern of Israeli strikes and militant resistance continues, the ceasefire could collapse entirely, leading to a new phase of conflict. Intelligence assessments from regional observers indicate that both sides are quietly repositioning forces, preparing for the possibility that the truce may not hold. Israel has redeployed additional infantry units near the Gaza border, while Hamas fighters have been seen regrouping in areas previously vacated under the ceasefire terms. In Tel Aviv, political pressure is building on the government to clarify its objectives. Hardline figures are demanding the continuation of military pressure to prevent Hamas from rebuilding. Others argue that sustained attacks will only provoke more violence and international backlash. Meanwhile, the United States has warned Israel that further escalation could strain bilateral relations and complicate defense cooperation. From Washington's perspective, the ceasefire remains central to its broader Middle East policy. The White House views the agreement as a key step toward regional stability, especially amid ongoing tensions involving Iran and Hezbollah. A breakdown in Gaza could ripple across the region, emboldening militant networks and undermining diplomatic efforts elsewhere. American officials have reportedly urged Israel to coordinate closely with mediators and avoid actions that could jeopardize the larger strategic framework. Despite diplomatic appeals, the reality in Gaza continues to worsen. In neighborhoods like Shujoiya, Jabalia, and Rafah, residents describe a sense of despair. Food distribution lines stretch for hours, and entire families survive on limited rations, many fear that the ceasefire's breakdown will plunge them back into full-scale warfare. International journalists, restricted from freely entering the area, rely on local correspondents to document conditions that remain among the most difficult in the world. Satellite imagery from recent days shows widespread destruction still visible across central Gaza, collapsed apartment blocks, cratered roads, and damaged medical facilities. Reconstruction efforts that began under the ceasefire have now stalled. Thousands of families who started rebuilding homes have been forced to abandon them again due to renewed bombardments. Schools that were converted into temporary shelters are overcrowded and undersupplied. The psychological toll on civilians is also mounting. Mental health organizations report sharp increases in trauma-related cases among children, who have now lived through multiple rounds of conflict with little sense of security. Aid workers note that the lack of stability is preventing any meaningful recovery process. Looking ahead, analysts see two possible paths. The first is that both Israel and Hamas, under international pressure, reaffirm the ceasefire, allowing humanitarian agencies to expand aid operations and begin early reconstruction. This would require confidence, building measures, including hostage releases and Israeli commitments to halt strikes outside immediate threat zones. The second and more likely scenario is that the current pattern of limited attacks escalates into open warfare, undoing months of negotiation and plunging Gaza back into crisis. In conclusion, the fragile U.S.-brokered ceasefire in Gaza stands on the edge of collapse. Israeli operations continue to stretch its limits, while Hamas struggles to maintain internal control and avoid further provocations. The humanitarian situation remains dire, with millions trapped between political deadlock and military confrontation. The United States and regional partners face a rapidly closing window to salvage the truce. For now, the world watches closely as the narrow line between uneasy calm and renewed war grows thinner by the hour. Thank you for watching Ballistic Beacon. Stay tuned for verified updates and analysis as this developing situation continues to unfold across Gaza and the wider Middle East.